What's up, everybody? Welcome to System Crafters. I'm David Wilson, and I get asked pretty regularly about how I achieve the look of the presentations that I give from within Emacs. I made another video about this in the past showing how to use a package called org tree slide for presentations, but I've actually been using another package called org present for the last year or two. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I achieve the presentation style that you see in this video using org present and a few other customizations that I came up with. And if you check the link in the show notes in the description of the video, I provide a complete Emacs configuration that will replicate what you see here on the screen right now. If you just go to the very last part of the show notes document, you'll see that configuration. It's not a complete Emacs configuration that you can use for everything. It just shows you the end-to-end process of how to set up the look that you see here. So please make sure to give this video a like if you learned something useful from it today. So org present can be installed from either the non-GNU or Melpa package archives. And if you don't know already, Emacs has a built-in package manager called package.el, which can use package archives to find either sort of sanctioned Emacs packages or community Emacs packages that you can install into your Emacs config. I prefer using the non-GNU archive since it's already a part of the default set of package archives in Emacs 28, which is really nice because you can find a lot of useful stuff there, things that aren't necessarily licensed to the Free Software Foundation, which is sort of the requirement for the ELPA package archive. We can talk about that in a whole different video. However, if you're using Emacs 27 or below, you will need to add this line to your configuration. It basically calls the add to list function to add this non-GNU repository, the name non-GNU, and the URL for that to the package archives variable. Now, as usual, in these videos, we're going to talk about a lot of functions in Emacs and a lot of variables as well. So I recommend using the describe function and describe variable commands. I think I covered that in the first video of this new Emacs from Scratch series. To learn more about those, because maybe I won't give a whole lot of details because I'm just going to go through the configuration. So you should go check those out using, like if I use meta-x describe variable on this package archives variable, it will tell me about what the default values are and explain a little bit to you. So very useful stuff in case you need to get some extra documentation on anything we show here. Also, I want to mention that if you followed other videos of mine where I show how to set up configurations from scratch, like the really original Emacs from Scratch series, I probably told you to set up the Melpa package archive already. So if you've already done that, if you have the Melpa archive configured for your package archives, you do not need to put the non-GNU archive also. However, I do sort of prefer the non-GNU archive these days, so you might give it a shot and see if you can find the packages you need from that. So after you add this entry to the archives, you might need to run the meta-x package refresh contents command to pull down all of the package listings for the non-GNU archive so that you will be able to find org present when you try to install it using this next command, package install. Probably you're familiar with this if you've used Emacs for a little while. So you can install the org present package that way, or ideally by adding the following lines to your configuration, basically using the package installed p function to see if org present is already installed, and if it's not, we will then install it using the package install function. And then we use this little unless macro to make it a little bit easier to do the if check. So I also want to mention that in this video, I'm going to be showing Emacs Lisp snippets that don't use configuration macros like use package or setup.el. I'm just going to show you the raw Emacs Lisp that you can use in your configuration. And if you know how to use package or setup.el or some other package like this, you can probably figure out how to translate these settings into, or translate the configuration snippets into your own configuration. But I figured it would be better to show just the direct way to set these things so that you could learn some things if you haven't seen how to do this already. So the basics of org present. Let's just take a look at what org present looks like without any customization. Like right when you first install it out of the box, what does it look like? I'm going to open up an org mode file and then I'll run the org present command. So I've got a very basic configuration here started already with just a couple things to help me out. And then I set up the package system. I check and install for org present. I also install another package we'll talk about in a little bit. And that's it. We don't really do anything special here. So I'm going to run Emacs with this configuration. And very plain, because this Emacs configuration doesn't do anything, doesn't set the theme or anything. So we just see a normal org mode document. Now I'm going to use meta-x and run the org-present command. And you can see us go into the presentation, but it still looks pretty basic. In fact, you don't see anything except for the title of the document on the screen. I'm going to use the left and right arrow keys to go forward and backward in the slides. So if I press the right arrow, it will move me to the next slide. And then I can just keep moving forward through all the slides. Let me get back to the slides here, my actual slides. So the thing to know about org present is that the presentations are being displayed with a specific pattern by default. The very first slide in the presentation is going to be your title for the document, the org mode document, and then any text that comes directly after that. So if I were to go here and say author David Wilson and save that and then run org present again, it will show the title and it will also show anything that I have after that title before the first heading in the document. And then every subsequent slide is basically the contents of the next first level heading in the document and anything that comes after that, even other subheadings. So every top level heading in the document becomes a slide effectively. So as I arrow through the document, I'm just getting every top level heading and everything that comes after it. Even subheadings, like in this case, we have numbers and then operations as a subheading. And then maybe there's a couple other subheadings here. So that's what you need to know about how presentations are organized inside of org present. And it looks pretty basic, right? Like there's not a whole lot of stuff going on. It doesn't really change the way the Emacs looks very much. It just sort of shows the content of each heading, only that heading at the time on the screen. But that's actually great because it means that we can use everything that we know about Emacs customization to make it look however we want and to behave however we want. We'll show a little bit of an example of that a little bit later. But before we get into customization, let's talk about the essential key bindings for this package that you'll need to know when you start using it. Like I mentioned before, the left and right arrow keys will run the org present prev and next commands for going forward and backward in the slides. But there's also the Control C, I guess, left angle bracket. I don't know exactly if that's the right way to call that. And then right angle bracket for going to the beginning and the end of the presentation, respectively. There's also an important one that is Control C, Control Q to exit the presentation. So if I go in the presentation, I can use Control C and then left angle bracket to go back to the first slide. I can also use Control C, Control Q to exit out of the presentation to put me back into the normal view of this org mode document. There's also the Control C, Control R, and then the Control C, Control W commands for setting the presentation to be read only or make it back to read write mode. I don't really use this, but it could be useful if you end up accidentally editing your presentation while you're looking at it. So that could be something that you might want to know about. You can also bind your own keys that get turned on only in presentation mode by setting them in the org present mode key map. So that could be pretty useful if you like to change out maybe like the navigation keys or something like that. So, in my opinion, the display of org present doesn't really look much like a presentation unless we do the bare minimum, which is centering the text on the screen. Because in a presentation slide, typically things would be centered on the screen. It's sort of like a nice rectangular view with the content centered. Right now, when we turn on org present, what we see is that it's just the same content, but just in the top left-hand corner of the buffer. And it doesn't really look too much like a presentation for me. The other people, maybe it's fine, but I prefer to center things on the screen. So luckily there's a very simple package called Visual Fill Column, which helps with this. And there's two ways that we might want to use it. The first one is to keep it enabled permanently by turning it on for every org mode document by using the org mode hook, which is what I do because I kind of like the way that it makes my documents look. Or you can only turn it on when you're giving a presentation. So whenever you're not presenting, you'll have the normal left aligned document text. And then when you turn on your presentation, the content will be centered. So like I said, I use it all the time for org documents, but in this example, I'm going to show you how to turn it on only for presentation, just using some hook functions, which will also turn out to be useful later for other things. So I've already got that Visual Fill Column Mode package installed, so I can show you exactly what it will do when I turn it on here. So I'm just going to run MetaX Visual Fill Column Mode, and then it just basically puts that right there in the center of the screen. And the important part about that is that I have some settings here that dictate what the column width is going to be. So I have it set to like 110 characters. That basically just tells this package how wide you want the column to be in the center, but it will center it when you set this column center text to true. So it's pretty useful that it can do that. So now let's break down what we need to do to make this get turned on only whenever we go into a presentation. First of all, we're going to need to create functions for configuring the current buffer when starting and stopping a presentation. So when we're in that buffer and we tell it to start the presentation with the org present command, configure the buffer to display it correctly the way that we want it. We also want to enable centering only when starting the presentation, and then disable it when we end the presentation. So we need to have two different functions for managing that. We also need to add these functions to the org present mode hook and the org present mode quit hook, which is the hook for starting the presentation and ending the presentation. So when you have functions that can configure for starting and stopping, then you just add them to these hooks. And I also use another mode that comes with Emacs called visual line mode to cause lines to be wrapped within the centered document. Otherwise, you'll have to horizontally scroll to see them all. Let me see if I can go to a slide quickly that shows an example of this. Right here. So this last line here, you can see that it gets cut off at the end where it says when talking about, whoops. And you have to sort of scroll over to see everything. So it's not so ideal. And if I were to just run visual line mode right now, you can see how it wraps that. So that just helps us to have everything all on one screen at the same time. So the actual configuration we'll use for this, aside from the installing the visual fill column package and configuring it lightly, we're going to have two functions, one called my.org.present.start and one called my.org.present.end. And they basically just turn on and off this visual fill column mode and visual line mode. And like I said before, we're going to add them to the org.present mode hook and org.present mode quit hook. So I'm going to copy this stuff over to the, let me get out of this. I'm going to copy it over to the init.el file. I'm just going to paste in right here. Then I'm going to run that Emacs configuration one more time. And now what's going to happen is I'm going to run org present, and then it's going to automatically set up that visual fill column mode and the line wrapping. So if we go back to that one slide, you can see that that line here is also wrapped. So that's pretty easy. It doesn't really take much effort to make org present look a little bit better out of the box to center things on the screen, and that may be enough for you just with that alone. But let's take a look at some other things that we can do. The next thing would be to make the text look a lot bigger because it's a little bit unreadable at the default size. Maybe it's a comfortable size for you to read when you're working on your computer, but if you're giving a presentation, you probably want the text to be bigger, like what you see here on this screen. So there's a very cool variable for this in Emacs that's built in called face remapping a list. And it basically allows you to set a list of face overrides for the current buffer using the setQLocal function. So there's a lot of terminology just in that couple sentences. Let me try to unpack it a little bit. In Emacs, a face is basically a configuration for how a range of text on a buffer is going to be displayed. So maybe the color, the background color, the font, the size, the style of the font, a lot of other dimensions like that are controlled by a face. And this face remapping a list is basically just a list of configurations of specific faces that get applied inside the current buffer whenever you use this setQLocal function. So it's very useful for overriding the way a particular face looks in the current buffer without changing it all over Emacs. You don't have to have all of your faces set to be huge. You can only have it in the current buffer. And the interesting thing about this is that you can also use relative font heights based on existing faces. So instead of hard coding the font sizes for everything, you can actually have multipliers for the font size to make it a certain percentage bigger effectively, so that you can base everything off of your normal default font size. So we're going to add the following snippet to the my.org.present.start function, and this will set the face remapping a list with some overrides for a few different things that we might want to customize. I'll drop it in right here in the org.present.start function. Let me just see if I can, get that lined up. And what you can see here is that we are overriding the default font face, which is basically the basis for all faces in Emacs, is the normal text face. We're setting the height to 1.5, which is basically 1.5 times larger than what it normally is. Or I guess 50% larger, not sure. But anyway, it's definitely larger than the original size. We're also setting it based on the variable pitch font, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then we set the header line, the document title, and a few other elements of the org mode document faces to tweak the size on those. So we also need to think about the resetting the fonts back to their normal size after we get out of the presentation. So we can do that by using a different list in the face remapping a list to clear that back out. I'll paste this in and tell you what it's doing. So basically this is setting face remapping a list back to just a plain list with only the default face being configured. And I want to point out that if you use variable pitch fonts, which we'll talk about in the next slide, You do need to set this back the way that I have it here, at least as far as I know, because otherwise it will clear the variable pitch fonts from your buffer after you go out of your presentation. So in my config, I have this here to just reset the default font back to variable pitch so that it does not mess with the way that my org mode buffers look normally. So just keep that in mind. So what I'll do is run the configuration one more time. And then once it gets loaded up, I can use org present. And then we'll see that the fonts look much bigger and much nicer now that I have this set up. And you can even tell that it's not a monospaced font anymore. And we're going to get into that in just a second. So already it's starting to make a big difference. But we also can tell that some things in the document are a little bit too big. So we're going to do some other customization on that in a moment to sort of tame these face sizes. So let's make sure that I didn't miss anything. All right, so now the color theme and fonts that you use are going to make a big impact on how your presentation looks. And an important impact or important aspect of the look is the use of variable pitch fonts for most of the text in org mode files so that your slides look more like a document than a source code file. Now, what a variable pitch font is a font where the characters don't all have to be the same width. So that's the difference between that and a monospaced font, like what you see for most code editing, where all characters are the same width so that you get like a regular grid of characters on the screen. But since we want this to look more like a document and a normal presentation, we're going to use a variable pitch font to have a more document-like appearance, like what you see on the screen right now. The variable pitch mode and the variable pitch face will do a lot to help to make your presentation look a lot more polished, and I'll show you how to set those up. The font and theme selection that you have is purely a matter of taste, but I'll tell you exactly what I'm using so that you can use it as a starting point in case you like the way that mine look. First of all, for the fixed pitch font, the default font, I use JetBrains Mono with the light weight, not the normal weight. I also use the Iosevka IL or AIL, not sure how to pronounce that, for the variable pitch font, also with a lightweight. And then for the color theme, I use the Doom Themes package, and I load the Doom Pale Night theme from there, which gives you this color theme, which is basically the basis of all the System Crafters colors. So if you want to have exactly the same kind of look of the presentations, then that's your starting point. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this little snippet and drop it into the init.el file. And so what we're doing here is just making sure that Doom Themes is installed, load up the Doom Pale Night theme, and then we're setting the default face, the fixed pitch face, both of those to JetBrains Mono. And we're also setting the variable pitch face to that Iosevka AIL font, like I mentioned before. And if we were to run this configuration, package Doom Themes is unavailable. That's interesting. So, and maybe this is one that's not actually in the non-GNU repo, so I might have to install the Melpa repo for that. So it does turn out that I needed to have Melpa installed to get Doom Themes. As you can see here, I just had to add this line to my configuration. I'll add this to the configuration that I give you at the end of the slides, just so that you have that as well. But if you go look at the configuration now, after I got Doom Themes installed, it does look different because we loaded the Doom Pale Night theme. And if I jump into the org present command, now we can see that the fonts look different. The title of the document looks different. And then also the slides start to have the sort of same style that the System Crafter slides do that you see in this document here. So with just that set of fonts and a color theme, it starts to make things look a whole lot better. But we still do have some other tweaking to do to make everything look perfect. So what we're going to do next is try to tweak some settings in org mode. So org mode provides a wide variety of variables and faces for customizing its appearance. And here's a list of the things that we're going to want to customize to get the best look for the slides. First of all, we're going to increase the size of heading text using the org-level-number from 1 to 10 faces. And basically, every heading level in org mode has a face, so that you can control the color, the size, the font of those individually. We're also going to make a few text elements like tables, code text, and more use a properly sized fixed width font, which is important for making sure that things show up correctly, or maybe just text that's supposed to be code will show up with a monospaced font. We're also going to hide formatting markers for bold, italic, and code text using the org hide emphasis markers variable. And the important thing there is that with these things like bold, italic, and code text, if you try to delete something here, let's see if I delete the character at the end. Yeah, okay, it doesn't actually pick it up the right way. But the idea is that these there's characters around this text. Let me just get out of my presentation. You can see it here. So these characters like code text will go away now that we have that variable turned on. All right, so also we're going to ensure that code blocks use a fixed width font at the right size so that they look good merged in with the presentation. We'll make the presentation title a bit larger to make it stand out. And we'll also add some space between the top of the window or the top of the frame and the slide heading so that it gives it a little bit of breathing room, because right now you can see that the title or the current heading is kind of stuck to the top of the window, and we kind of want to give it a little bit of breathing room at the top, sort of like what you see on the screen. So what we'll do is copy this snippet of configuration, and then I'll explain what each of these things are doing, because there's quite a few lines here that we'll have to take a look at. So I'll drop this all down right about here. And then let me close this instance and then run another Emacs instance. So I will go ahead and run the configuration. And we can see that the text inside of code blocks is now a lot more tamed. The text inside of these little code text elements is a lot more tamed. I think I deleted something in the slide. But pretty much everything looks a lot more smooth now, which is nice. And the way that this works is, like I mentioned before, we set this org hide emphasis markers to true to make all those little things around the words go away. We use do list to set all these various faces for org level, set the org level faces to have different text scales to make them bigger or smaller depending on which level the heading is at. And it's important to require the org faces package before doing this, because sometimes these faces are not loaded at startup in your configuration. So requiring that will make sure that these faces are available to be customized. Also, we tweak the document title, make the text a bit bigger on that, also make it bold. And then we set face attributes for a bunch of different things to make them either fixed pitch or sort of tweak their faces just slightly based on different criteria. Probably is something that you'll want to experiment with yourself to see how to get it the way that you want it to look, but this is sort of the set of things that I use in my own presentations. And one last thing we need to do to get to set the heading text for the presentation buffer so the extra space that we want to show up actually does show up. And we actually did a little bit of work for this before in a previous slide where, let me see, where we set the face remapping. We set this header line face to have a height of 4.0, which sounds pretty big, but that's because we're just trying to make that header line be big enough to give a gap at the top of the screen. But that is not enough by itself. What you also have to do is go into your org present start hook function right here, and then we're going to paste in this line that sets the header line format to be an empty string, basically a string with one space in it, so that it does actually activate that part of the buffer to make it visible. We're also going to want to go into the org present end function and set it back to nil once we end the presentation, so that that buffer goes away. So if I close this, and the reason why I keep reopening it is just to have a clean startup. So I'm going to reopen this configuration, and you'll see now that when I run org present, there's a nice little gap between the title and the heading with the top of the screen. So we're looking very, very much like the System Crafters presentations now, the way that everything looks here. And another thing we can do to improve the look of our presentation overall is to get rid of some unnecessary UI elements that might distract from the experience. So things like the menu bar, the toolbar, the scroll bar, etc. We don't really need all these things visible in the buffer while we're giving presentations. So this is another thing that you can do only in your hook function, or you can just do it all the time in your configuration. And if you've watched some of my configuration videos, often I've told you to turn off some of these elements so that you don't have them hanging around all the time. But we're definitely going to do it in this configuration where we'll copy these lines to turn off the menu bar, toolbar, and scroll bar. And we're also going to use some frame transparency so that the desktop background peeks through a little bit. And the reason why I like to do that is just to give the slides a bit more dimension, a little bit more interest to them, so that it's not just a flat color. So I'm going to run this configuration again so we can see what that looks like. And then I'll say org present. And now you basically have the System Crafter slide style. It's effectively the same thing as what you see on the screen for my actual presentation here. So that's all it really takes. I mean, there's a lot of customization you do, but it's not too hard once you know all of the various pieces. Now, one last thing to consider. When you have a lot of content on a single slide, it might actually make sense to break it up into subheadings so that it isn't shown on the screen all at one time. Like on this screen, I actually have a lot of content and it goes off of the end and I have to keep scrolling down to see it all. Not ideal in a lot of cases, but I don't really follow my own rules sometimes. But if you want to tame that a little bit, it can be good to use subheadings in a slide to only show the part of the content you want to show for that slide at the given time. But just putting content in the subheadings is not enough. You also need to tell org present to collapse those subheadings whenever it shows a slide so that their contents aren't initially visible. And I'll show you what I mean in the example slide. So right here, let's see. I think it's in the number slide. We have numbers, which is the main heading, and then we have operations under that. And we just keep scrolling. We have operations. I think there's something else even after that. Yeah, predicates. So what I would like is to see those things folded by default or collapsed by default so that you only see the headings whenever you get to the slide. So to set up a slide correctly as we enter it, we can define a new function, another hook function basically called my/org present prepare slide, and then call some standard org mode functions to do the following. First thing is to hide everything except for that main heading. Then we unfold the content of the heading, and then we show the immediate children of the heading, but without actually expanding their content. So you just get the headings as a list under the main content of the slide. So I'm gonna copy this code here, and then I'll show you what that does. Let's put this in down here at the bottom. We also need to set up this particular hook function as well. So I'm gonna copy this next snippet that adds it to the org present after navigate functions. Now, this is a little bit confusing because you see the name of this hook variable and it doesn't end with -hook, it ends with -functions. The thing to know here is that in Emacs, there's a configuration where hook functions that you add to a -hook variable do not accept parameters. But if you have a hook that needs to actually pass parameters to the function that gets called, they usually use the -functions name instead of the -hook name. And you can see here that this function that I'm defining has two parameters, the buffer name and the heading. So org present wants to give you details about which slide that you just entered into. So it has to use this naming convention to indicate that the function actually takes parameters. And if you use describe variable with Control-HV, it will tell you, well, I think it's supposed to tell you that it has those parameters, but if you look at the source of org present, you'll be able to tell that it takes parameters. So anyway, just letting you know that this is why that's a different name there in case you were wondering. So I will go ahead and run the presentation one more time. Looks like I have multiple instances open, no problem. I'll run org present. And then whenever I enter the slides, whoops, I used the wrong key binding. Let's see, let's go back to that, was it numbers? Yeah, so when I go into the numbers slide and I scroll down a little bit, you can see that the operations, predicates, and comparisons are collapsed already, and I can use tab to expand those. So that's something I like to do in presentations sometimes, is just to have these sections collapsed, and then when I get to them, I can expand them and then collapse them when I'm finished. So that will keep your slides a little bit cleaner without having a lot of stuff just hanging around in there. So now you can give nice presentations in Emacs. That's basically all that I have to show you about it because that's all I use in my own presentations. And we probably covered a lot more than you expected in this video, but I think it's an interesting use case in seeing how a variety of Emacs features and packages can enable you to create something fully custom and surprisingly nice, even though it starts as very, very basic. So it just sort of fits into the whole Emacs model. So let me know in the comments of this video, do you think that you're gonna try to give your next presentation in Emacs using a style like this? And if you've already done this before, what strategies or packages did you use whenever you set up a presentation in Emacs? So don't forget to check out the final configuration that I've got in the show notes. The link's in the description. It's a lot more of a polished version of what we showed today, and you can just take it and put it into an init.el to get everything set up automatically if you want to. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy hacking. See ya.